Hey guys, so I thought this time it'd be kind of fun to get into some general history on comic books, namely something that helped shape the industry or almost destroy the industry for almost 5 or 6 decades. I'm talking about the Comic Code Authority. So, the Comic Code Authority, originally formed in September of 1954 in response to a widespread public concern over gory and horrific comic book content. It was mostly constructed by two men, Charles F. Murphy, who did majority of the work in forming of this new comic authority, who was a specialist in juvenile delinquency, even though any idiot with two brain cells can see that comic books weren't causing this, but okay, and Frederick Wareham, writer of the 1954 book Seduction of the Innocent. The Comic Code Authority, or CCA, was based upon a largely unenforced code drafted by the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers in 1948, which in turn had been modeled loosely after the 1930 Hollywood Production Code, which is something for a completely different show and another time. Keep in mind that the Comic Code Authority was formed in 1954 and would be about 5 to 6 decades before the internet would be in wide use. It should also be kept in mind that majority of the fans of these books were at this time still young children, and as young children, well, there's not really anything you can do about this. This code banned graphic depictions of violence and gore, and crime and horror comics as well. Also, sometimes including sexual innuendo, and even at times if the main character was of a different skin color. Wow! And that all comics must observe the quote-unquote good girl art. Any comic titles that does not observe the good girl art would be dismissed by the CCA, and many comic shops would not carry any non-approved comics, as noted by one historian, served as the enforcement arm of the Comic Code Authority by agreeing to handle only those comics with the seal, out of fear from either parent groups or from individual parents themselves. Writer William Gaines believed that the clauses forbidding the words crime, horror, and terror in comic books had been deliberately aimed at his own best-selling titles, crime suspense stories, The Vault of Horror, and Tales from the Crypt. Yes, this is the same Tales from the Crypt that made Tales from the Crypt Keeper, a 90s children's cartoon, which also made a 60s children's show. Yeah. Anyways, these restrictions, as well as those banning vampires, werewolves, and zombies, helped make EC Comics unprofitable. All of its titles, except for Mad, which many years later was bought by DC Comics, were cancelled in that year. In the following year, CCA's introductions and attempts by EC to launch code-friendly replacement titles were unsuccessful. Mad itself survived because Gaines, who had converted the publication to a magazine format, to which the code did not apply. Wareham dismissed the code later on as an inadequate half-measure, whereas comics analyst Scott McCloud, on the other hand, commented that it was as if, in drawing up the code, the list of requirements a film needs to receive a G rating was doubled, and there are no other acceptable ratings. The next part of this would be the beginning of the end. The code was revisited a number of times in January 28th, 1971, to allow for, among other things, the sometimes sympathetic depiction of criminal behavior and corruption among public figures, as long as it was portrayed and exampled that the culprit was punished later on, as well as permitting some criminal activities to kill law enforcement officers and to suggest but not portray seduction. Also, newly allowed were vampires, ghouls, and werewolves to try and compete against the underground comics which had started in the late 60s. But they could only have these creatures if portrayed in the traditional sense, such as Frankenstein, Dracula, and other high-caliber literary works written by Edgar Allan Poe, Skye, and Conan Doyle, the other respected authors whose works are read in schools around the world. By the 1980s, greater depiction of violence had become acceptable. For example, an El Eva's House of Mystery, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, in February 1986 contained numerous decapitations, but was still code approved. The end finally came in 2001 when Marvel Comics withdrew from the CCA in favor of its own rating system to distinguish appropriate age groups. In January 2011, DC Comics announced that it would discontinue participation and adopting of a rating system similar to Marvel's. The company noted that it submitted comics for approval through December 2010, but would not say to whom they were submitting. A day later, Archie Comics, the only other publisher still participating in the code, announced that it was discontinuing it, rendering the code defunct. This would eventually end the Comic Code Authority, well, pretty much up until this date. And for some reason, people think this is going to come back again. Okay, guys, we have the internet. If this did happen, the underground comic scene would burst open at a spectacularly alarming rate. So yeah, I don't really think we have anything to fear. I'm CJ, and next time I'll be talking about an actual character. Yeah, probably won't be doing this for a while. Just saying.